We're going to watch this 2018 New York City Advisory Commission on Property Tax Reform. The setting is it's in the city council. They love the place. He worked there 20 years ago, somebody who was speaking earlier, and it looks a lot better now. So yeah, they have new rug and some people, the citizens, were actually allowed to attend this, and some people I know attended. And now let's just listen to what somehow this person is not a lawyer, he's not this, he's not that, but he's the one presenting.
These properties, how do you treat them differently versus how do you treat them the same? And you'll see in various leaders throughout further on, that's where you kind of apply those different treatments. But the other consideration to have is when you do create classes, what are the relationship between the classes? You're effectively creating many property tax systems by creating classes. So in some ways the systems will be different, in some ways they'll be the same. What is the relationship between the systems? New York City, for example, their relationship is tied through the tax rate system, which we'll get to in a bit. So Class 1 is related to Class 2 through the rate system. New York City, you can also consider, for example, classification. It's not a requirement of a property tax system. There are systems out there that don't have any classes, that is just everyone's in one class and you apply the treatments equally. You might have variations, but there's no idea of classification. There are systems where you might put commercial property into one class and residential property into another class, so you have two classes. Ontario is an extreme example where they have 36 classes and subclasses of properties. Everything from shopping malls as one class, forests, agriculture, small residential, new development properties is another class. So that's one extreme. New York City has 4 classes, major classes I should say. There are a few subclasses as well. This sound familiar from Karen's presentation in July. These classes were developed in the 1970s and early 80s. Consideration here, lever consideration might be, do those classes make sense in the New York City of today? The city has changed, obviously, since the late 70s, early 80s. Maybe there's some difference there. Classes in New York City currently have different treatments and similar treatments based on assessment rules. You know that Class 2 and Class 4, for example, are assessed at the same ratio to full value. They have similar treatments and changes in assessment.
What is he talking about? Class 4 is commercial. The Class 2 is 45% of the assessed value is 45% of the market value, but the market value in Class 2 is not real market value, what you and I think of as market value, but instead the 10-year capitalization or how much rent they're going to get in 10 years. But I think he just said that Class 4 is treated the same way, which, let's listen to that. That doesn't sound right.
Of today. The city has changed, obviously, since the late 70s, early 80s. Maybe there's some difference there. Classes in New York City currently have different treatments and similar treatments based on assessment rules. You know that Class 2 and Class 4, for example, are assessed at the same ratio to full value. They have similar treatments and changes in assessments, but then Class 1 has different treatments. There are different rates to each of the 4.
What does he mean, ratio to full value? What does that even mean? I'm confused by... So is this, I hate to say this, but is this the blind leading the blind? Next, we'll hear the commissioners asking very simple questions as if these commissioners or these advisory commission people don't know the property tax system. They're asking, well, is the classification in state law? Obviously, everything is in state law. New York City is a municipality. It's a municipal corporation. It is not an entity in and of itself. It is a municipal corporation within a state. The federal government deals with sovereign states. I don't think it deals directly with a city, right? It has to go through the state. So this is very troubling. Listening to this 6 years later, it sounds. I hate to say this, but it sounds like the blind leading the blind.
Classes, and as I noted earlier, each of these classes have different rates, and the rate system is what ties them together. That kind of creates it as a unified system overall. I'm going to go through a bit. I know that may sound a bit confusing, but I'll go through a bit about this when I get to the rate system. So,
Emma, can I just ask one question about that?
Why are doctors using this weird lamp to eliminate mold from their clinics?
And in 15 minutes, you know what?
That's an embarrassment,
the
Google.
4 classes are set by state statute.
Yes.
So to change those 4 classes would require a change in the legislative
correct.
Ordering here. But the subclasses, how are the subclasses?
I believe they are also set in state law. I'm not going to. I don't want to. I don't have the.
How can she not know that? This is our friend Vicky Bean. How can she not know that all the classes have to be in state law? Because New York City is a creature of the state. Oh my goodness. Oh gosh. How do you get that?
So I don't. But my recollection is that they are also set in state statute.
Thank you.
And they have changed.
They have, right, exactly. So when the system was first set up, I believe, and let me walk that back a little bit. I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to kind of give wrong information, but that's something to look into, sort of what has changed and what hasn't changed since that time.
So you hear that? This person doesn't even know what has changed, not the history of it. What is he there for if he doesn't know the history of the property tax system? Why don't we just get some person off the street and say, well, they gave me the script, I'm just going to read the script. You ask him any questions, I'm sorry, that's not on the script.
Any other questions on this slide?
Well, you're not even answering their questions.
I would just add, since I've been here, I've heard suggestions for 1-class system, 2-class system, 3-class system, folding utilities in with other commercial properties, 4-class system, and a 5-class system. So there's been a range of suggestions discussed.
So the next set of levers are within the framework of value. What do we mean by the base of what we're taxing here? What do we mean by property? What exactly are we taxing? And when we think of that thing, how do we translate that item into a number that a value that we can tax, right? So this is a bit sort of out there, I realize, and I think I want to take a moment to walk through this. So think of a home, a one-family home. And it has 3 bedrooms. It's located around the corner from a train station, a subway station, 2,000 square feet in a certain neighborhood. You could think about what the value of that property is based on how much someone might be willing to pay for it on an open market, right? So that's, I think, an easy consideration for us to have. So if that value, let's say that value, we decide that value is about $1 million, right? That's just it's in a nice neighborhood. Now, think about what happens if the city decides to rezone that neighborhood and say, that property, you can now build a 30-story multifamily building on that lot. How does that affect the value of that property? Now you're thinking about, well, maybe the value of that property is more than $1 million because I can take that, I can tear it down, and I can build a property, a multifamily residential building that is worth a lot more. I think it's important to think about then what value you want to use. Do you want to use the value, the first value that we're talking about, the value in the current use, the current structure? Or do you want to think about the full potential value that someone might pay in the market? How do you restrict that? You know, we think about the physical aspect of the property, but there's also a legal structure that the property exists within. What are the rights you have upon that property to adjust it, to use it? There are considerations around how legal restrictions such as rent stabilization might affect the value, current leases might affect the value, those kinds of things. I think going back to value, you'll recall in the DOF presentation back in July, their slide 7 went into a bit more about how they value income-producing properties. And in that, there was a note about how, and I'll just read the quote, projected cash flows are generally not included in mass appraisals. They're difficult to estimate for mass appraisal purposes, and courts have deemed them too speculative. Such anticipation of future appreciation is, however, reflected in sales prices. And those sales prices are used in the valuation of single-family and 2- and 3-family homes. So, in effect, the city already has slightly different definitions of value for different types of property. The question is, should we use the same definition of value, different definitions of value? What are the implications of those different definitions of value? And how do we, when do you want them to be the same or different? So that's one lever, I think, to think about what we mean by value and what do we mean by property. Once you figured out that sort of theoretical thought process, then you come to how do you determine the value of this property? The property tax is different than other taxes, most other taxes, in that there isn't necessarily a transactive event that occurs that will give you a specific value for which you to tax. So you can think about the sales tax. If I buy a pair of shoes for $120, the $120, that's the base of my value, and that's what I'm going to tax it on. Now you may have some adjustments based on that, but there's an easy part to register there. The property tax is based on a theoretical idea of what the value will be.
It should be the same, just like a sales tax, right? You bought the property at one point, keep that value. Now, of course, if they transfer from generation to generation, that's a problem, but that's the problem the city has. That's the way the system used to work. But, of course, they don't want that because they want budget and money.
In a certain context, whatever we're defining that to be. So, how do you determine that value? It's a difficult process. I think my colleagues at the Department of Finance do a lot of very good work to value the over 1 million parcels of property every year. That's a lot of work to do, I think, and they've over the years have worked to improve that process. But you can think about what.
Well, think about that. It's done by a computer, right? So he's just admitting that he is involved in this. They are using very poor systems to do that. We have a condemned house right next to a livable building, and they're both valued by the Department of Finance at the same value. $1 million. How in the world can the condemned house be the same value as a livable house? Plus, we have carriage houses here in Brooklyn where they value them at $5 million, $10 million. Where did that come from? It's still just a one-family house or a two-family house, right? Their computer, this man just admitted that he helps with this system. Doesn't look at anything. I don't think it quality assures, spot checks, at all. It's just some computer runs and outputs probably in a few milliseconds 1 million values based on sales. It doesn't even seem to take into consideration buildings condemned. Unbelievable.
What methodologies you might want to use? Again, back to the prior presentation, we heard about 3 major methodologies. Comparable sales-based valuation, income-based valuation, and cost valuation. But then even within those methodologies, there are variations on how you do them. There may be levers there in how you use methodology to kind of get to that value. There are considerations about the data limitations you have around estimating these values. We're creating an estimate. We have to kind of have information to help us make those estimations. So what cells do you use? We collect, for example, real property income and expense statements from income-producing properties, which helps provide a basis to value those properties. There are legal restrictions around how we can value, most notably with the co-ops and condos. Section 581A of the Real Property Tax Law of New York State requires that DOF value those properties as if they were not co-ops and condos, or in other words, as rentals. how does that affect the value, and how do we want to adjust that? Is that a good lever to use? Is it a bad lever? Are there other restrictions we want to place?
Did you hear what he just said? The law requires that condos and co-ops be valued as if they are not co-ops and condos. This is going around. You can use their own words. You don't need comedy. Real life is more hilarious than comedy.
In there, and I also note minimize, in terms of valuing the base, you want to think about how to minimize inaccuracies. As I noted, these are estimates. When you're doing estimates, that's usually based on a statistical model, not always, but in any estimate, you're going to have some degree of error. That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's just the reality of the situation. The goal here is how do you minimize those errors? And there are several ways to think about that, and these are also levers to think about. You can improve the way you value those properties. So improve the methodologies, improve the data. What are steps that can be taken there? Hopefully give me 1 second. Another set of levers is, once you think about how you improve the process to create those values, how do you review what you came up with? How do you make sure that how do you know you're as accurate as possible? What does accuracy mean?
Quality, yes, that's exactly right. When do they even have a system to speak with these computer generated statistical models? Do they have any? They don't even announce that they use computers to do it very clearly to the public.
In the situation, and part of that is quality assurance, part of that is data reporting that others can
Bingo, quality assurance, you heard it. Where is it?
Quality assurance, monitoring, data analysis, what levels of analysis are you using, what are the metrics you want to use to kind of view how something is accurate. And then there's the last part is the individual property owner and their ability to come back and sort of have a comment on the valuation. I mean, much of what we're talking about is mass appraisal, mass assessment, mass analysis, mass data analysis. We're talking about 1 million parcels of property. The appeals process is a moment for us to look at more granular level of how accurate something might be and see if there's anything idiosyncratic about that property that maybe affects the value. So again, that's another lever to think about how value might come into play. Right? Am I making sense here? Is this?
Well, I'd just like to...
It amazes me that it's 2024 and people are still wearing in-the-ear earbuds, so you can get rid of these and get rid of these.
Well, I'd just like to... I don't know if it's ask a question or make a statement, but I think one of the things that's different and special about the property tax is that all this information is public.
Yes.
You're dealing with other kinds of tax policy, like the income tax. All right, individual information is not public. All of this is, and so that's, I guess, what I wanted to ask. Everything you've just been discussing, from air rights to all these other things that are maybe unique parts of commercial property, is all public information. Is that correct? No. Okay.
The RPIEs are not public.
I would say the results to a degree
are public.
are in a general sense. I'm going to speak in generalities here. Just there might be this property tax system, as you will learn if you don't already know, is there the exceptions prove the rule here. There are always. You can't make any blanket statements in a lot of ways, but I would say that the results tend to be public. Here's the market value of this property. Yes, you can go on the DOT's website, look up that parcel of property, see what the value is.
Well,
how they got there.
The sales prices are public.
Transactive sales are.
Actions are all public.
Right, but we don't know, for example, as Commissioner Bean mentioned, what the income and expense of that particular property is. DOF does report on the income expense they use to value that property, the estimated income expense, but the exact, if that property filed a real property income and expense statement, we don't have access to that data as the public.
Right, and there's also time lags in when you get the information, and I think that's that's another issue that we kind of have to deal with about the leads and lags, the time leads and lags in
Correct.
in doing the valuations.
Right, the data, which data are you using?
The data are not.
Right.
I would say, though, the Department of Finance does publish every year, when you get the notice of property value, kind of details on how the computations are done. As you said, like for comparable rentals are used, those are all published. So the RPIE is the main data that's confidential.
I believe that's the only one that's confidential.
Right, yeah.
Everything else is public.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted people to.
Correct.
So I will touch on this a little bit later too about this level of what can be public and what shouldn't be public in terms of data, but also the methodologies that DF use. The surface is there, but to some degree, the real detailed methodology is not necessarily public, and there are reasons for that. So and we'll get into that in a little bit, but I just wanted to, yes, unlike other like the income tax, there's more public here than there are for other taxes.
I want to take us back to the base. In looking at the base, what you emphasized is, the city mostly uses the current, treats property by its current use, though with the exception of vacant land. And there are a lot of other places that do highest and best use as an alternative for valuation. But there is something even more basic.
Could you repeat what you said at the beginning, Ray?
For most purposes, and please correct me, Mike, if I've gone wrong on this, the city uses the current use of the property when looking at the value of things, with the exception of vacant land, which it treats by the best uses, the highest and best use. But there are other places that look at all property through highest and best use. So that's something to think about. That has ups and downs for the cities. It's not. But the other thing more basic is what we tax. With property tax, we tax land and we tax the improvement of land. Now, there are places that just tax land, which in New York City would mean the location, right? And, from that's the whole Henry George thing, and I'm sure somebody will come in to talk to us about the virtues of a pure land tax. So we can think about shifting the whole thing onto the value of location. There's some economic reasons why that's good, some administrative reasons why that's a headache. On the other hand, there are places that also tax, I haven't looked at this much, but also go further. They tax land, the improvement, and certain kinds of personal property rather than just real property. So once again, that's another system that just looks at the base that we also could consider.
I would just add that, that's a valid point, but when you look at methodologies, when you use best use, you also have methodological issues. One of the issues when you're doing mass appraisal, if you're kind of projecting forward, you have to look at things like discounted cash flow, and using, often there's not enough cells to actually do a cells-based valuation method for certain types of properties, like commercial properties. So, these are trade-offs. There are issues of current use, best use, but then methodologically, there's issues of what produces the most valid and horizontal equity result.
So who decides what is in the base? So, for example, air rights, right? Thank you. Who decides that we don't tax air rights or we do tax air rights? Is that a definition by state law, or
I think it is a definition by law. So, yes, it is a state law issue. So air rights, for example, are subject to transfer taxes if you trade an air right, but they're not part of the base of what's in the property tax system. And as Ray says, some jurisdictions do include personal property, but often they have kind of default provisions that, you have a safe harbor. You can say my value is worth X, and then they don't actually assess the personal property. It's more like they have classifications and it's kind of plug numbers. I think jurisdictions in general are kind of moving away from personal property. But the real property questions he raises, I think, is going to be an issue for this group. Methodology, what's included, air rights versus other things, and then the issue of, the trade-offs of how do you, the data collection is essential, and the best data is current use. So once you get into future use, it's a valid point. You might want to look at it. It just becomes a little more speculative.
So when air rights are transferred from one property to another, it does nothing to the property tax of the parcel that it got transferred from or to. It's only when those air rights are used to actually build something that turns into something that's
That's correct. We don't tax the development right per se. Undeveloped is not part of the real property tax system.
So is that a sales tax that's imposed on a transfer of air rights?
Well, transfers are subject to the one-time real property transfer tax, but it's not part of the ongoing property tax system. It's only as the co-chair, when it's developed, that it becomes. And there's zoning issues of how you develop air rights. That's a hot issue now. You know, buildings on top of buildings, things like that. There are rules that we don't allow a totally separate owned building to be built on top of another building. So that's a hot issue. It has to be merged or has to become a condominium.
Not to digress unduly, but how do you compute the transfer tax?
The transfer tax is kind of like an excise tax. It's the value of the transfer times the tax rate. So if it's commercial, I think it's over 3% now.
Can I pursue that just one step further? For commercial building or any building that allows a billboard or uses billboards or uses the whole, or the issue of signage, and I assume that is, I don't know, so I'm asking the question. I assume that that's like an extra lease, and that's just going in the RPI, that we have no way of having data, separate data on how much this generates and where it generates and how much is governed by law or not.
Well, it's part of the income and expense form, and landlord is supposed to report that type of income.
But is that governed by zoning?
The zoning is the underlying issue of the usage, and if it's done, then the property tax.
Whether you can have something on the side of your building, is that?
Yeah, that's a zoning issue.
Zoning issue. It's a zoning issue. Okay.
Hasn't always been enforced in the city, but it's a zoning.
Okay.
I beg your pardon.
So it's getting taxed into the value of the building by whatever income it's generating.
Exactly.
Great. Okay. Thanks.
So are there other, air rights are obviously an issue in terms of whether they should be included, and that's a discussion that's going on around the city. Are there other controversies over what should be added to the base that we should know about?
Look at this. They're getting sidetracked on air rights. We're talking about millions and millions of Class 1 properties, and they care about developers and air rights. It was a very special case in Manhattan over luxury high-rise buildings, and that's what they're focused on. That tells you something.
I think for real property tax purposes, the issue becomes more the valuation of land versus the improvement. And generally, all real property is part of the base. I mean, the utility tax has issues that personal property is subject to the utility tax, so that's one thing that can be viewed. But I think in general, there may be issues of land underwater, those kind of issues, but I think for most, land and the improvements on it are part of the real property tax base. The issue becomes treatment of various components, and as the presentation is saying, the inter-class dimension to it.
But it shows up in the value of a sale, is when you first see it, right? So, sort of a different version of value capture.
But you raised the issue, or somebody raised the issue, you did, Ray, I think, of personal property tax. And my experience in other places is in places that have large amounts of industrial use property, then the personal property tax gets at machinery, and it could, I guess, in the 21st century, get at technology. And you could take, I guess, some information-based companies and their real estate and tax also their personal property, if personal property were in the form of I don't know, servers and data mining exercises. I don't know if it's done anywhere, but I'm just...
Are they going off the deep end? This has nothing to do with property tax. We're going to tax servers. I never even noticed how detached these people are. What are they talking about? Taxing servers. What does that even mean?
Just raising it because personal property relates to a different part of the economy. It's just that it hasn't been a big base in the New York City economy in our lifetime, but it was in previous lifetimes.
Right, it's the whole issue underneath. the utility class 3.
Yes,
for
yes.
What used to be railroad properties and the improvements on them, as well as telegraphing.
Exactly, and now what ought to be considered a utility.
Right.
Yeah.
One last question, at least from me on this. When a property is, let's say, reserved for affordable housing, is it taxed as, in terms of its value as affordable housing? Or is it taxed as its value as housing in general, without limitation?
I mean, it's generally still subject to income and expense rules, although the affordable, we do get from like HPD information on which units are affordable. So often the income and expenses reflect that, but it's not like there's a legal separation. It's more just the economics of the building determines the value. But that's an issue that can be explored, whether or not there should be more targeted.
And the question of whether or not those affordability restrictions expire is calculated in or not? It's not, if it's just income and
It's generally
expense.
based the income and expense flow at a given point in time. As we're saying, we get the income and expense statements, they're lagged by, so we'll receive them in June of this year for the prior calendar year. And then the information gets adjusted going forward, and what will be published are the adjusted numbers that you can see on anyone's notice of property value.
Thanks. Okay.
All right. I guess this presentation is working. It's sparking conversation and discussion about these different levers here, so that's good. So now you've done the difficult process of determining what it is you want to tax, how you want to define that, how you're going to determine that value and make sure it's as accurate as you want it to be. Then you may want to adjust that value for tax purposes. This is an area where I think often policymakers kind of focus on the property tax, and so this will seem a bit more familiar, but currently our system has two major flavors of adjustments to the value for tax purposes. The first is assessment rules, and the second one is exemptions. So assessment rules these are endemic to the property. As we mentioned earlier, they're the classification of property into 4 classes, and then there are also subclasses. These will affect these assessment rules. So the first of these is the fractional, and by endemic I mean that the owner doesn't have to take any action, it's just based on the property demographic itself. The first assessment rule is the concept of fractional assessment. So in New York City, we do not tax at the full value of the property. We take a fraction of that value, and that's the assessed value. For Class 1 properties, that's supposed to be 6% of a property. For all other properties, it's 45% of the full value. These fractions are determined by the Commissioner of Finance. You can change them on an annual basis, though by nature they usually stay put, and they've been changed several times though in the past that I can think of. The next aspect of these assessment rules is that
the key is he did say that the assessment ratios have been changed in the past. Most people don't even admit that, but I think in 2006 was the last time that Class 1 assessment ratio was changed to its existing 6% now.
there are growth limits on how fast those fractionalized assessments can grow.
That's exactly the caps that this proposal is trying to get rid of. But caps are good because they limit what government can do. Right? Let's repeat that. Limit. Remember, the original government, the Constitution, was a form of limited government. If you read the Bill of Rights, they tell us what government cannot do. Shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. Shall make no law abridging anything, right? The Sixth Amendment, one of them says, the state will make no law that takes away property. What was the one? There's one that's really good, which we'll talk about later, but this is sad.
You'll recall that there are caps on small residential properties. They cannot, for example, a class 1, 2, and 3 family home cannot see its assessment grow more than 6% in any 1 year or 20% in any 5-year period. Similarly, for 4 to 10 unit residential properties, those caps are 8 and 30%. All other properties except for utilities see their changes in assessed value phased in over a 5-year period. And then with a few small exceptions, these caps and phase-ins don't apply to changes in assessments that are caused by physical changes. So if you construct a new building and the value increases, the assessment increase will not be covered by those caps. So some of the levers here are to think about fractional assessments. Do they make sense? Is that thinking about from the transparency angle, the equity angle, the fairness angle? Maybe this is a method to sort of allow us to do these assessment growth limits and play around with those separate from the value. So maybe it's a sort of a thought process division here. These growth limits levers here are these the right kind of growth limits? So should they be expanded, reduced, adjusted? There are questions, for example.
We're going to stop here because he's saying should they be expanded to. Their proposal is to throw it all out. To throw out all limits. That's what they proposed. So people, wake up. They're going to throw out all limits. This just goes against the fundamental founding of the country. The limited government. That's what the Constitution says. So you should be very, very, and we should be very, very concerned. Peace out.